Hi, I'm Nicola Dibben and I'm Professor of Music at the University of Sheffield. Studying music in higher education is much more than simply teaching and learning how to play an instrument, and it's more than composing or listening to and analysing music. It's also about significance of music to us as individuals and to society at large. And today's talk is an example of that, because I want us to think about how music might be relevant to one of the most important challenges humans have faced, the climate emergency. And what I'm going to do in this recording is to explain why this is an important topic and give you some key ideas to think about so we can come back to those in the webinar. There's now compelling evidence that our planet is undergoing climate change caused by our actions. And this has huge consequences for biodiversity and for human well-being. This has gained increasing attention, not least from young people through strikes for climate action. And representatives from almost every country in the world are coming together at the 26th United Nations Conference on Climate Change, so COP26, in Glasgow in the first weeks of November 2021. So given that situation, I personally feel an ethical motivation to understand how the activity that I'm engaged in might be part of the problem or the solution. But the other reason for looking at this topic is that music is already involved in and part of that problem. So let's have a look at the ways that it is. There are two main ways that music is or might be part of the problem and perhaps the solution that climate change represents. First, through the impacts of live music making, and second, through the impacts of experiencing music. And I'm going to deal with each of these in turn, starting with the question of how environmentally sustainable music making, production, sharing and consumption really are. So what does the word sustainability mean in the context of music? Well, the overall challenge is, quote, to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And that's from the World Commission on Environment and Development from 1987. Sustainability has traditionally been thought of as comprising three pillars. So these are the financial or economic viability, environmental responsibility, and social equity. It's been estimated that the live music sector contributes around 75% of music industry carbon emissions. And of these, energy use is the biggest contributing factor. So for both for on-site and off-site things like diesel generators and travel and so on. There's also waste, perhaps from camping, food packaging, human waste and so on. And that's not even taking into account the travel impact of touring artists attending gigs, of which festivals are just one sort. So agencies and researchers have been working hard to understand these impacts and create policies, and individual musicians and bands have had their own initiatives as well. So for example, Massive Attack partnered with a university to try and understand what the impacts of their touring was and how they might minimise those. And what about the environmental impact of recorded music? What's the most sustainable way for musicians to distribute their recordings in the 21st century? And what's the most sustainable way for consumers to listen to those recordings? Well, these are actually really difficult questions to answer, but in a paper from last year, so 2020, two musicologists, Brennan and Devine, worked out the relative carbon footprint of different formats. Well, how did they do that? Well, they calculated the environmental costs of the materials of different formats. That ranges from shellac-based gramophone records from the 1900s to the 1950s, through petrochemical plastics of LPs, 45 records, cassettes and CDs, and through to the 2000s and the impacts of digital formats, so streaming, for example. In all cases, including the digital, the music had environmental impacts because the materials have to be mined, often under environmentally damaging conditions. They're assembled in factories, often with poor labour conditions and within a capitalist system of planned obsolescence. So Devine and Brennan then compared these figures for the year of peak sales for each type of format. So the circles that you'll see, they represent the peak year for LP, cassette, CD and digital audio downloads and streaming files. So which of those do you think produces the most carbon dioxide emissions, for example? The answer is that digital formats are creating the most emissions. To do both with the kind of processes involved and the amount of music being consumed, so the total units consumed is actually more. Turning now to the second way in which music might raise awareness of climate change and influence people's attitudes and behaviours. I'm going to focus on musical experiences, and what I mean by that is the way that music might communicate ideas about climate change or perhaps influence people's awareness or attitudes or behaviours. Music has a long history of representing the natural world and or mediating our relationship with it. Composers use a range of compositional techniques to do this. For example, 19th and 20th century European classical music composers helped construct ideas of the nation by representing landscapes associated with that nation. And now, in the 21st century, music engages more with what we might call the ecological commons, so the idea that we're concerned with global problems of climate change, which isn't just restricted to a single nation, for example. And there are techniques of doing this. So 19th century, you might be familiar with program music, the idea of there being a narrative or a theme to the music that composer is expressing through the composition. There are also audio-visual contexts for this, so film music in particular. People might incorporate field recordings, so using the sounds of a glacier within a composition. People also use sound to sonify data, so in other words, to take data and turn it into music. I'm going to give 3 examples which illustrate some different approaches to composing environmentalist music. My first example is the use of music to communicate information. So this is the sonification of data. In this composition, you'll hear a drone, which represents carbon dioxide concentration, and you'll hear strings, which represents the average annual temperature. Now, in this composition, you might want to think about how you are experiencing the information. In what way, how effectively does this communicate information about carbon dioxide emissions over time to you? And here is the same data presented visually. What do you think? Which is more effective for you and why? My second example is a piece of music that's directly about climate change, what it is, and the different perspectives or reactions to it. Here, pianist Sarah Nichols' piece, 12 Years, is directly about the issues as they were in 2020. So she was inspired by the news that in 2018 we had 12 years to change our behaviour.
80s climate change warning.
Huge risk if global warming passes 1.5 degrees.
We are about 1.1 degrees Celsius warmer than the pre-industrial baseline. We are now outside the window of temperatures that enclose all of human history.
sixth mass extinction event underway, scientists warn.
Earth's sixth mass extinction event.
Mass extinction.
One atomic bomb, atomic bomb, atomic bomb, atomic bomb, atomic bomb.
Mass extinction. Mass extinction. Mass extinction.
Scientists said that they purposefully avoided scaring people, so as not to turn them off the issue.
There are a lot of reasons why scientists have been cautious in talking about climate change. Some of it is just temperamental. As scientists, they are very, very careful, and they understand that any exaggeration or hyperbole will be used against them. And they also often pointed to some social science research suggesting that in certain ways, these messaging built around hope and optimism was more motivating than fear and alarm.
In terms of compositional techniques, Sarah Nichols is using words and extracts of real speech, drawing on our knowledge and reactions to those. She's using the inside-out piano to simulate environmental sounds. So she said that she used it to create the sounds of wildfire or to imitate the sounds of a glacier, for example. And she uses conventional signifiers of emotion, so things that you'd be familiar with from film music, for example, so fear and alarm in the Good News Please piece, for example. And note it ends on the words fear and alarm, and the music is in that realm of cinematic music writing, of thriller and alarm, so using staccato and jabbing sounds, for example. What this piece seems to be doing, therefore, is raising awareness of climate change, sharing information about it, and reaching certain audiences who attend for musical reasons rather than purely environmentalist ones. Sarah Nichols is presenting, I think, a pretty bleak picture, a sort of catastrophe model, and she's using environmental sounds, layering those with speech, making us listen to the speeches and maybe hearing them in a new way, or hearing other people's perspectives on those speeches and issues as well. So she's creating a space, perhaps then, for reflection and awareness of different attitudes towards climate change. My third example is perhaps more familiar. It's the soundtrack to the BBC series Planet Earth. And this one, I think, celebrates the natural world rather than inducing panic or fear. And here the premise seems to be that if we can feel how wonderful the world is, then maybe we won't damage it. So what's the music doing, and what idea of nature does it conjure up? Well, it helps create excitement. Think about the use of the camera shots, for example, in this video clip. There's decreasing pace of the camera shots and an increasing musical texture. The entry of percussion, synchrony between camera cuts and downbeats of the music. There's a gradual build. I would say that it creates a sense of awe through the music, a kind of a well-established psychological response, which is a thrills, chills response, so shiver down the spine, which is associated with particular kinds of musical structures, which we find here in this music trailer. So let's consider what work music does in the world. Well, we can see that music raises awareness of issues among certain audiences, perhaps through using it in protest, in concerts and gigs, perhaps to raise money for environmental causes. There's also the fact that it raises the profile of the organisation and the ethical stance of those organisations. Some people accuse organisations of greenwashing, for instance, being associated with environmentalism as a way of promoting oneself. Thirdly, music also brings people together in virtual or imagined activist communities as well as in live performance. So it has a perhaps important social role in that regard. Music creates a space for dialogue, so it offers opportunities for resistance perhaps to social conditioning. It allows people to imagine different ways of being, of living together. And lastly, music can represent and express the natural world through sound, and perhaps in doing so it can encourage us to adopt certain attitudes towards it. But the follow-on question from this, of course, is whether it might influence our behaviours. So I've suggested that music is both part of the problem of climate change and potentially part of the solution. Practically, we can use more sustainable ways to make and consume music, and music is helping to form activist networks who might bring about change. Music can also be composed to communicate certain ideas about the environment, perhaps give us information, help us celebrate or help us protest. It can help us adopt certain relationships to the environment perhaps, or to elicit emotional reactions to it. However, we don't yet really know whether and how such experiences might lead to any real changes in behaviour. I think Brennan and Dibben put it very well when they said that rather than think about how we make music about the Anthropocene, we should think about how we make music in the Anthropocene. In our webinar, we're going to think about these ideas a bit more together, and to help you do that, I'd like you to think about the following 3 questions. First, what is music's environmental impact, and are there things we could do to reduce it? You can think about live music making and about the recording industry and about the ways we consume music, including our formats and the devices we use. Second, for those of you particularly interested in music performance and composition, have a think about the music that's been made. What musical techniques have composers used to create music about the natural world, and to what extent are these able to influence people's attitudes and behaviours towards it, do you think? And lastly, given everything you know about the impact of music on the environment now, is the environmental harm that music does acceptable when balanced against the other pillars of sustainability, so against the economic cost and the societal cost and benefits? So those are the questions I'd like you to think about for our webinar, and here are some suggestions of things to read, watch and listen to before we meet that might help you think about and answer those questions for yourselves. I'm looking forward to our webinar to hear your perspectives on the relevance of music to environmental action and climate change.